Folks, thanks for coming along tonight, where Matthew Levitt makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute, talking on the topic of what Iran up to in the Middle East. Now, I'll introduce him briefly. He's Froma Wexler Senior Fellow and Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Reinhard Program on Counter-Terrorism and Intelligence. And as I said, talking on the very topical topic of what's Iran up to in the Middle East. Matthew Levitt, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been quite a few years since I stood at this podium. The view's the same, and it's a real pleasure to be back here. No good deed goes unpunished, so here I am again. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming, and to those of you who are watching either live on Zoom now or on the recording later. The answer to what is Iran up to in the Middle East is a lot. But before we get to what they're doing now, I think it's critically important to take a big step back. One needs to understand two critical things about the Islamic Republic of Iran. The first is that there are two parallel sets of security services. There's the army, the Artesh, whose job it is to defend the borders of Iran. And there is the Revolutionary Guard and its Quds Force. The Revolutionary Guard's purpose is not to defend the borders of Iran. It is to defend the revolution against opponents within and without of the borders of Iran, and through the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, to export the revolution. Now, on the latter, on the exporting the revolution, it's critical to remember that before Iran was interrupted by a very terrible war with Iraq, it actually, after the revolution, created entire agencies and departments for the sole purpose of exporting the revolution. And that's where the history of Iran's effort to cultivate and build and develop and fund and arm proxies throughout the region begins. It doesn't begin with anything Israel did. It begins with what Iran wanted to do in terms of exporting its own revolution. And so it looked around the region to countries where there were other Shia communities, mostly minority communities. And the first and most attractive and most important place for Iran was Lebanon, not only because of the size of the Shia community, but because there were historical, family, and educational links between the Shia community in Lebanon and those in Iran and in Iraq, because there were so many Lebanese who had gone to study in the religious seminaries in Najaf and in Qom, had married into families in Iran and Iraq, and so there were strong historical ties. This gave them a tremendous opportunity. And so within months and just a couple of years of the revolution, Iran sent some 1,500 Revolutionary Guardsmen to Lebanon, to the Bekaa Valley, for the purpose of helping to coalesce into one organized element, at least under one organized umbrella, a variety of different motley crew Shia organizations that at the time were fighting each other and other sectarian elements of Lebanese society as much as they were fighting the Israelis, and thus began what we now know as Hezbollah, literally the party of God. And it's important for me to highlight Hezbollah because that's the topic of my book, which has just come out in its 4th edition and will be available here in Australia in a week and a half. Thank you very much. It's not the only reason I'm here, but it's part of the reason I'm here. I'm not going to lie to you. Over the years, Iran has doubled and tripled down on this strategy of building proxies, and it has done so itself, and it has done so through Hezbollah, which is its first among equals. So when we had the Iraq War, Hezbollah was leaned on by the Iranians to serve as the trainers for what have become the very capable Shia militias in Iraq, Kataib Hezbollah, Asaib al-Haq, and a whole host of others. The Iranians, it turns out, we now know from interrogations of people who were detained at the time, some of which have become public, that the Iraqis, who are, while the ones we're talking about, while Shia are Arab, not Persian, did not much appreciate the Iranian attitude, because the Iranians didn't just come and say, well, here's how you fire this particular piece of weaponry. They also assumed, Iraqis, they probably don't know how to pray appropriately. So they really talked down to them. And then it also turns out that they didn't have enough people who spoke fluent Arabic. And so it was attractive for them to have the Lebanese, Arab, Lebanese Hezbollah come and be trainers, something they'd done very effectively over the years anyway, because as fellow Arabs, they didn't talk down to the Iraqis. They obviously spoke Arabic. And so Hezbollah built an entire unit called Unit 3800, whose sole purpose was to go and train the Iraqi militias, and then in several really important cases actually help them carry out operations, in particular targeting US and British forces. A little bit of context. Fast forward to today, or really the past year plus. There is zero question, I mean literally zero question, that Iran and Hezbollah were fully knowledgeable, not of the date October 7th, but of the plot that was going to happen. 2 years earlier, right after the last Hamas rocket war with Israel, Hamas stood back and said under Yahya Sinwar, this is not working. Yahya Sinwar, the now deceased late Yahya Sinwar, was the real deal. And for him, governance in Gaza was getting in the way of the real work that needed to be done from his mind of destroying Israel. If all he wanted to do was jump up and punch Israel in the nose every 12, 18, 24 months and start a rocket war, fine. They were doing it. If all he wanted was to be able to say every so often, no, we haven't forgotten our quote unquote resistance against Israel, we're doing it. They were doing, they could check that box, but he was getting nowhere towards his goal, and a goal he thought was real and achievable, of at least starting a process. In his mind, I think he's absolutely wrong, but in his mind, an irreversible process that someday will lead to the destruction of Israel. And so after that rocket war with Israel in 2021, he said, we have to change everything. And we know, because they said it themselves, that Hamas and Hezbollah and Iranian Revolutionary Guardsmen started meeting in what they called, not my term, their term, a joint war room in Beirut, 2 years before October 7th. Now, Hamas understood and appreciated the capabilities of Israeli intelligence, and frankly, they had a pretty good idea, if only a logical assumption, that the Israelis were very, very focused on trying to penetrate Hezbollah. Fast forward to the past few weeks, they were not wrong. And they wanted to make sure that the Israelis didn't find out about or defeat Hezbollah's efforts to pull off an incredible intelligence coup, which I'm not thrilled to concede, they did, leading the Israelis to think that they, Hamas, prioritized their governance project in Gaza over fighting Israel. Right? So Hezbollah, Iran, no question, they did not know that October 7th, that morning, something was going to happen. But they absolutely knew and provided strategic guidance. And based on documents that have recently been discovered in Gaza, and some of which have been made public, Iran increased its funding for Hamas in advance leading up to this as well. No question. No question. So the first thing of what is Iran trying to do in the region is it is trying to operationalize this network of proxies so that they are integrated, so that if one proxy is in a fight, all the other proxies get involved. This was the brainchild of General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, who was killed during the previous Trump administration in a targeted killing in Iraq, along with a very important Iraqi Shia militia leader who was serving as one of Qasem Soleimani's deputies. And some people might have thought that this brainchild died with him. They've been proven wrong. And what we see now is Iran trying to successfully operationalizing, and now trying to institute as the new normal a reality in which, choose your terminology, Israel is permanently surrounded by a ring of fire. Iran's proxies are uniting the fronts in an effort to put significant pressure on Israel, and through Israel on the West, including things like more regular rocket fire on US forces in Iraq, etc. But that's only one piece of what they're doing. Iran is strategic in its thinking. And I think one of the, and its thinking and how it operationalizes those ideas. And we in the West, we work on short election cycles, right? I hear we just had one at home. I hear you're likely to have one by no later than, what is it, May, right? It becomes difficult to plan out, especially when you're switching out parties, but even when you're not, to plan out strategy over a period of time, but the Iranians do. And not only because they're not democracies and they're able, in a society where you don't have to ask anybody's permission, and the supreme leader says this is what it is and this is how it is. Some of the other things they're doing, the nuclear program. Iran, while we've all been paying attention to October 7th and the wars that have been going on since, Iran has been ratcheting up its nuclear program. And just now, when the IAEA was about to issue a report calling them out, Iran said very clearly, if you do that, we will respond in an appropriate manner. In other words, Iran won't even allow you to call them out for the bad behavior they're doing. There will be a consequence for calling them out for that behavior. And in the end, there was a negotiation where it appears they won't be called out, but they'll just pause their enrichment for a moment. It seems to me very likely that the issue of Iran's nuclear program comes to not the head, but a head fairly soon. Certainly, I would imagine within the first 2 years of President-elect Trump's administration, and maybe sooner. And one of the reasons it may become sooner is because all these things are integrated. And when Iran has a policy of trying to institute a new normal of circling Israel in a ring of fire, Israel, for its part, is trying to push back on that and institute its new normal, which is they're no longer going to sit back and, in an effort to, quote, maintain the calm, which is what Israeli officials have told me over the years when I've asked, you know, you keep briefing me on all the new weaponry Hezbollah has and all the new tunnels they have, and Hamas is not doing nothing. They were also digging hundreds of kilometers of tunnels. Are you not kicking the can down the road? And their answer to me over the years was the policy is maintain the calm. They're no longer going to allow adversaries that literally have pledged to their destruction to accumulate weapons so long as someone thinks they can be deterred. Among Israeli strategic thinkers, defense, intelligence, security officials, the word deterrence no longer holds a lot of credibility. For most, it's a dirty word. Deterrence alone is not going to be how things are. Deterrence as a piece of the puzzle, sure. And on top of that, the Israeli position now is taking the fight to their enemies. Right. So the Houthis penetrate Israeli airspace with a drone that crashes into Tel Aviv. The Israelis take out Houthi oil containers, storage facilities. It's not that was supposed to destroy the Houthis or severely undermine the Houthis, but they're no longer going to let actions like that go unanswered. That presents problems for Iran, because now the Israelis have taken the fight to Hezbollah in a way, in a way that has never been done before. No terrorist group, no militant group has ever been so decimated. What the Israelis achieved, if submitted to Hollywood as a script, would be laughed away. It is a cheap paperback novel, too fanciful. No one would have believed it. Somewhere around, perhaps upwards of 70% of Hezbollah's medium, long-range, and precision-guided rockets and munitions have reportedly been destroyed. Hezbollah's entire frontline forward-deployed weaponry, tunnels, bunkers along the blue line, the UN demarcated border between Lebanon and Israel, are now being swept away. It's not the case that Israel will destroy every rocket. You look at it, just watch the news. Hezbollah is still able to do some nasty stuff, especially with shorter range rockets, but they also have to be careful because they just don't have as many anymore. The threat that Hezbollah had over Israel for many years now, that they could potentially rain 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 rockets a day on Israel, overwhelming even Israel's four-tier air defense system, is gone. They certainly can't do it for weeks and weeks on end. So the two big strategic threats, not every threat, there's still Hezbollah, they're still dangerous, but the two big strategic threats facing Israel, huge numbers of long-range rockets and precision guided missiles, and on the other hand, the forward deployed weapons and bunkers and tunnels for a cross-border raid, they are severely degraded. And I mention it now because that makes a huge difference for Iran. Those long-range rockets were there and provided by Iran for two reasons. One, yes, to be able to threaten Israel and someday to be able to use them against Israel, but not in the moment. I mean, on October 8th, Hezbollah started firing short-range rockets, mostly anti-tank guided missiles, third-generation Cornet anti-tank guided missiles, into Israel. But everybody was pretty surprised they didn't do more. Hamas was certainly surprised and more than a little miffed that Hezbollah didn't do more. But Hezbollah was deterred, I think, or Hezbollah decided not to do more, I think, for two main reasons. One is Lebanon, for several years now, has been in a severe political and, far more importantly, economic crisis. Hezbollah has engaged in a bunch of behaviors over the years that have additionally undermined their position in Lebanon. Think, for example, about the tragedy of the Beirut explosion. If you read the Arab Barometer report and the polling data there, support for Hezbollah within Lebanon has been dropping steadily. Hezbollah is aware. For those people who say Hezbollah is only a terrorist organization, they're not a political movement, they're not a social movement in Lebanon, that's wrong. They are absolutely a terrorist organization. They've done things internationally. They're actually absolutely a militia, larger military than the Lebanese armed forces, with more rockets than most sovereign nations on earth. But they are Lebanese, and they care about their position in Lebanon, and they understood that nobody in Lebanon wanted them to enter this war of choice and risk the Israelis responding in a way that would further undermine the Lebanese economy. I anticipate that this time around, unlike the last war in 2006, you're not going to have a circling the wagons with many Lebanese saying, "Yay, Hezbollah, you stuck your finger in Israel's eye." This time around, Lebanese are going to be really annoyed that Hezbollah dragged them into a war they didn't want, that nobody but the hardest line people in Lebanon wanted. The second reason is because Iran, which has not suddenly become Zionist, did not want Hezbollah doing too much. Not because they, were interested in Israel's protection, but because they did not want Hezbollah to be in a position of having to use or Israel destroy too many of those rockets. That's now happened. And so Iran, in the moment, is in a very bad position. They've severely miscalculated. They no longer have the Hezbollah rockets to serve as a deterrent against Israel or anybody else targeting them or targeting their nuclear program. They no longer have those as a second strike capability should anybody do that. And not only that, they've crossed the Rubicon of now attacking Israel directly, not once, but twice. In April, they fired a three-tiered 3D chess drones that go about the speed of a car, low-altitude cruise missiles that go about the speed of a civilian aircraft, and ballistic missiles that go up and come down in about 18 to 22 minutes, coming from different angles, from different places and different times. It was a tremendous puzzle, which the Israelis and U.S. Central Command, with help from a few others, successfully defeated. Iran fired some 300 projectiles at Israel. Basically, none of them hit anything. Israel responds with about, I don't know, let's say about a dozen projectiles, all of which reportedly hit. And hit, among other things, Russian S-300 air defense systems, which happened to be located right outside a pretty important Iranian nuclear facility. And the message is pretty clear. The Iranians decide to attack again, this time only with ballistic missiles, which gives a much, much shorter window to respond to them. Again, almost entirely failed. They did hit some bases, but they didn't destroy any significant infrastructure. And the Israelis this time around respond by taking out basically all of Iran's radar systems, by taking out critical components of the supply chain for the ballistic missile production. And now, Iran doesn't have so many ballistic missiles left. They're unable to produce new ones because the Israelis knocked out a particular component of that, and they're flying blind. And so it seemed to me very likely that in the first few days after that Israeli attack, when the supreme leader of Iran said, we're going to attack Israel, we're going to respond, we're going to do all these things, it seemed pretty clear that maybe he hadn't yet been briefed on what actually happened. A few days later, suddenly, he goes silent. Every once in a while, now, every few days, you'll get someone much more junior than the supreme leader of Iran who says, we're going to do something at a time and place of our choosing. It's no longer, it's coming any second, and it's no longer coming from the mouth of the supreme leader, because eventually he got briefed, sir, I'm sorry, but we have no radar. So if we hit the Israelis, we can't stop anything that they do. Oh, and by the way, if we respond to them again with more ballistic missiles, we're about to run out. I don't see the Russians providing the Iranians with new S-300s, both because the Russians need them, especially now that President Biden, in a lame duck session move, has given approval to the Ukrainians to do things that they have not allowed them to do in the past. And second, because the Russians aren't stupid. Are they going to put good money after bad? The Israelis just demonstrated they can take out all the S-300 systems. But that's not the only way Iran has miscalculated. Iran decided it would be a great idea to curry some favor with the Russians and provide them drones to attack Ukraine. Now, when I go to Europe, I'm not talking about in events like this with a camera. When I go and I talk to people privately, the many European governments are talking very differently about Iran, about Iran's nuclear program, about the threat that Iran presents by virtue of its relationship with Russia in particular, about the threat that Iran presents to the region, right? This region on fire over the past more than a year has had ramifications for all of us. It has ramifications domestically, right? I hear that in some cities you wake up in the morning and you find out that Jewish cars get vandalized on your streets. It happens in other countries, not just here. There's real trickle-down effects for what Iran has done, and even the Europeans are beginning to act differently. And there's one more reason. Because there's yet another layer of what Iran is doing. Not only in the region, you'll allow me to get a little more broad, but they do it in the region too. Since the revolution, Iran has used assassinations and abductions and intimidation of diaspora communities as a means of silencing their critics. Okay? One of the first assassinations was just outside Washington, D.C., just a few miles from my front door, my home. And they've been doing it ever since. But in the past few years, in the past decade in particular, the plots have been skyrocketing in numbers. In 2018, authorities in Europe thwarted a bombing plot of an anti-regime rally just outside Paris, where there were lots of current and former officials, government officials, including several current and former American prominent officials. That plot was thwarted. An Iranian diplomat based out of the embassy in Vienna, Asadollah Assadi, was arrested, tried in Belgium, convicted, later released because, of course, the Iranians did what they do pretty frequently. They've done it to Australians too. They arrested someone from Belgium who was in Iran on trumped-up charges of being a spy and told the Belgians there's only one way you get this guy out. I don't care how many years you sentenced our guy to. Those are trumped-up charges too, and the Belgians made the deal. The Iranians have been carrying out plots like this around the world, including in the United States. The most recent plot was one targeting former Canadian Attorney General Irwin Cotler in Canada. But as I map out the plots, and I've created an unclassified data set of these plots, I've created an interactive map. You can look at them at our website, washingtoninstitute.org. It's a free interactive map. And when you put out the pie graph, when you map it out, the highest number of plots over the past decade is in Europe. And even at times when things were sensitive, say negotiating over the JCPOA, or negotiating in the beginning of the Biden administration over the potential for a renewed JCPOA 2.0. Even in times and even in places that are sensitive, the Iranians continue operating. Now, I can't tell you if that's because they just don't care and they just go, go, go. I can't tell you if it's because there's a left hand, right hand going on in their bureaucracy. I can't tell you if the hardest line people in Iran acted during negotiations over an Iran deal because they wanted an Iran deal to fail. I can't answer the why. All I can tell you is that the Iranians have been carrying out these assassination, abduction, intimidation plots and surveillance to do them in the West and other places in a much more aggressive way than they had even before. And you put all of these things together, you get a sense of how disruptive a player Iran has become. The good news is the Iranian strikes on Israel, I think, have amounted to the single greatest commercial that anybody could have ever done to convince the world, but in particular countries in the Middle East, in particular the Gulf states, of the fact that Iran is the primary, most immediate, clear, and present danger to the region, and of the fact that a shared air defense with other countries in the region, including Israel in partnership with the United States, is not only absolutely necessary, but incredibly effective. I don't know, to be perfectly honest, if officials before the April strike knew that their air defense, this is a type of action that had never been tried before, would be successful. There was a tremendous amount of tension, but it was, not once, but twice. And so, for all that's happened since October 7th, for all of the trauma that Israelis have been through, for all of the trauma that Palestinians have been through, and making light of neither, to the contrary, conscious and pained by all of it, it's important to recognize the Abraham Accords did not fall apart. The Saudis are very sensitive to current events and are not about to revert to a table to discuss normalization immediately in the moment. But you will not find Saudi officials saying, nope, we don't want normalization with Israel. We don't want regional integration. They want it. They just don't want it this second. They want to see the war end. They want to see rebuilding of Gaza. They want to see something positive move forward. And then they would like, I believe, to be able to normalize with Israel and to integrate the region's, the air defense systems of the region's moderate states. They remember the Iranian strike on the Abqaiq oil fields. They remember the Iranian proxy strikes on the airport in Abu Dhabi, and they do not want to be that vulnerable again. So at the end of the day, what we are dealing with is a revolutionary regime that is not confident in its longevity. When it seems when it is the fact that of all the targets that Iran has been trying to kidnap and or kill over the past year, the person that they are most targeting, Masih Ali-Nejad, a, 5'2", petite woman with frizzy hair and a big flower in her hair. Amazing, amazing woman. But this is their great threat. So great that they've tried to kill her multiple times in multiple countries, including 2 plots in New York City. When I put together my data set of Iranian external operations, I kind of thought to myself, I'll probably see an increase in plots, but most likely in third world countries, in places where there's lax border security, relatively less capable law enforcement. And of course, we do see cases in places like that, but that's not where the majority are. They go where the target is. So they'll go to New York City, NYPD, FBI, they know what they're doing. I can prove it because none of the plots succeeded and they get guys behind bars now. But they will go, and the fact that Masih Alinejad is the woman they're afraid of says a lot, because she inspires women and men in Iran to stand up to the regime. Let's finish my opening remarks where we started. The reason they're looking at people like Masih Alinejad in particular, the reason the biggest spike in their external operations is not targeting Israelis, which they're still doing, is not targeting Jews, which they're still doing. Recently, a couple of plots in Germany and France targeting not Israelis, just German Jews and French Jews. It's not targeting Americans, which they're still doing to avenge the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. It's targeting dissidents. And the reason is because there's an Artesh, there's an army whose job it is to defend the borders of Iran. And there's the IRGC, whose job it is to defend the revolution. Masih Alinejad is a threat to the revolution. They understand that the supreme leader won't be here forever. They understand how weak they have become, how isolated they have become. And they will therefore, I predict, become more aggressive, not less so. Whether they are successful, as they were on October 7th, or whether they fail, as they have in the year since. Because from their perspective, they have to. They are there to protect the revolution, not to do what's in the best interest of the Iranians, not to make sure that Iranians can put a roof over their head and afford eggs and milk and gas in a cold Iranian winter, but to make sure that they have money for their nuclear program, to make sure that they have money for their proxies, because for them, this is about protecting and exporting the revolution. If you try and think about a revolutionary regime in terms that you're used to sitting in a democracy like Australia, you're going to fundamentally misread them. With that, I want to thank you again for allowing me to return to the Sydney Institute and look forward to pretending to have answers to all your questions.
So many thanks to Matthew Levitt. We'll come to questions in a minute, but first some business. So I should have said earlier, many thanks to the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council for making our speaker possible to come here today. And briefly, with the emphasis on briefly, what's the name of your book and what's your publisher and when's it coming out?
The book is called...
Come up, yeah.
Yeah. The book is called Hezbollah, the Global Footprint of Lebanon's Party of God. It originally came out in 2013 and has been updated now twice. It's published here in Australia and in the UK by Hearst Publishers. In the United States, it's published by Georgetown University Press. So the new Hearst version should be available in the next week and a half. Okay. Yeah, makes a wonderful Christmas and Hanukkah present.
Oh my God! I thought you were an academic. Let's come up here.
The only thing that's a better present is getting multiple copies.
Oh,
If you want to show you really love somebody.
You're an academic salesperson, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The marketing.
I thought
ends.
so. Okay, but it's got to end now. So come back here.
Yes.
Okay, and talk down there.
Yeah.
Now, I guess it's become a bit of a cliche these days, but the concept of the forever war, you read about it everywhere now. Is what you're talking about today, is it a forever war? I mean, when would it ever stop? I mean, we're dealing not simply with Iran, but also with Israel and Gaza and southern Lebanon.
And Ukraine and China, etc. I have a real problem with terms like forever war or endless wars, mostly because they assume that our adversaries don't get a vote, right? If your adversary is committed to fighting until the end, whatever that may be, especially if they are a revolutionary regime that operates under theological principles, and you choose that you're just not in this anymore, I guess that's a choice, but it's not a winning choice. Now, I support wholeheartedly, and in fact think it was overdue, for the United States to take a step back and reassess its international military and counterterrorism posture. The way we in the United States had been doing things for 20 years after 9/11 simply was not sustainable, not financially sustainable, and not otherwise. We have a huge over-the-horizon threat from China. We have an immediate problem with Russia, which is not just, sending out memes on the internet to sow division within our societies. We're talking about putting explosives on airplanes. And everything we've just discussed on Iran, in a region that simply we can't afford just to walk away from. So the question is not endless wars or forever wars. Yes, there are things we're going to have to contest bad guys for a while. How do you do it? Right? So for 20 years, the U.S. strategy was that these efforts would be U.S.-led and partner-enabled. As long as all of you are willing to step up and do something, I'll lead. That's not the case anymore. And by the way, you might be aware there's a little bit of political division going on back home, so much so, in fact, that I flew halfway across the world to avoid it, which was a poor calculation because you go abroad and it's all people want to talk about. But the only thing that both sides agree on, that Obama and Trump and Biden and Trump, again, they get annoyed when you say it to them because they don't like being seen to agree with each other. But this is the one and only thing they agreed upon on shifting this posture. Long overdue, so that it is now, wherever possible, partner-led and U.S.-enabled, flipped on its head. If someone is gunning for the United States, our homeland, if someone is gunning for our people or interests abroad, don't worry. I'm not going to ask you to be first. I'm there. I got it. You want to help me? That'd be great. But I don't need to be the person in the front row to deal with the Houthis or with Al-Qaeda affiliates in Africa. It's not that I won't be there. It's not that I won't show up. But I don't need to be first in line. And expect that that is a posture that is not going to change. In fact, will probably be underscored in the new Trump administration. So to me, the question is, how do you go about in a sustainable way contesting the efforts of bad actors? I'll give you one example, right, on Iran. If there's only one thing we take away from the past year plus, I think it's this. There is a tremendously, tremendously painful cost in human life and more if you allow Iran to continue to arm and fund its proxies without contestation. The number one thing we all have to step up and do, and there's a role for Australia. Australia is involved in the Maritime Joint Task Force. In fact, right now, as we speak, Australia holds the 6-month rotating presidency of the task force. An air, at sea, on land, intelligence-driven, military pursued, preventing Iran from being able to simply and easily be able to send not just handguns and Kalashnikovs, but huge rocket systems. If it weren't for Iran's provision of weapons to the Houthis, what are the Houthis? They are maybe a large, maybe a small thorn in the Saudi backside. And that's not okay, but it's not interrupting international shipping. It's not disrupting international supply chains. It's not firing rockets at another country, at Israel, hundreds of miles away. It's mind-boggling. So that is not something that requires sending 30,000 troops around the world and engaging in your endless or forever war. But there are times when you have to have troops in places for long times. I would argue If the US and others didn't do this in places like Germany and on the Korean Peninsula, we wouldn't have seen the stability relative stability that we've seen in those places since major wars. That's not always going to be the solution, but it can't be the case that it's off the table and never part of the solution.
I just want to go to the Gaza problem with the idea of forever in mind, and the hostility and everything, it just goes back so far, and there's a doggedness about it. Now, a mini Marshall Plan would be great for Gaza, but how are they going to get out of this mess? I mean, Israel is determined, for good reason, to get the hostages back. Israel is determined that Hamas will not survive, understand. But the place is an absolute devastation, like Europe after the war, Second World War. What steps could be taken in all of this sort of road jam to go beyond the war?
Yeah, that's a really, really hard question. It makes me want to kind of take steps in that direction and just, no, but the answer I think is this. Fundamentally, if we can get to a point where Hamas is weakened to the point that it is not part of the governance structure that follows, which is a legitimately non-negotiable issue for the Israelis, and by the way, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians, you could then have a situation where you could have a Marshall Plan. There are Gulf states that are willing to step up and step in, but they're not willing to do so and have to fight Hamas themselves. And I understand that, right? So this is where the problem is. A, we're not past the point of the hostages, either in terms of securing their release or, God forbid, this going on to a point where there are no more hostages alive. Of the 101 hostages that remain, we don't know an exact number, but a significant proportion, they're no longer with us. And it boggles the mind, and I appreciate the question because most people don't, that's just not a part of the equation anymore. And it drives so much of the Israeli trauma. People have asked me, why are the Israelis so traumatized? It happened more than a year ago. And I answer, so long as there are hostages, it's still happening. You in Australia, me in the United States, maybe not, but for the Israelis, it is. So we need to get to a point where Hamas isn't part of the solution. And it's critical to understand that from Hamas's perspective, that's exactly what they want, to be part of whatever comes next. They didn't want to be governing Gaza anymore. As I said, that was preventing them from being able to engage in their jihad against Israel. But they sure want to be, like Hezbollah at least used to be, and probably still will be in Lebanon, not the governing entity, but part of government. Hezbollah had ministers in the government. They have members of parliament with their allies. They have a blocking third in the parliament and able to make sure that certain legislation just never sees the light of day. This is what Hamas wanted in Gaza. Not to be held responsible or accountable for anything, get credit for whatever they do, be part of the government to influence it, but also be apart from the government, meaning to be able to maintain their own arms, caches, and effectively army. This has to be prevented at all costs, because only then will you have an opportunity to have a serious Marshall Plan type of response. And you're right, the level of devastation is such that that's the only way we can move forward.
Thank you for that. It's quite a complete demonstration of just how Machiavellian and incredibly complex the whole scene is. What is, it's a weird question, but the real depth between the differences between Shia and Sunni, would either of them step over the other to shoot Jews, or would the Sunni shoot a Shia before he shoots a Jew?
So, look, there are two schools, primary schools within Islam. The Sunni, which is about 80% of Muslims around the world, and the Shia, which that is then split again. For example, the Houthis are a different type of Shia practice than the Iranians. There has been a misnomer that still persists in some corners, that Sunni and Shia forever hate each other and can never cooperate together. It kind of resurfaced again for legitimate reason in the context of the Syrian war, because for a period of time, the Syrian war was deeply, deeply sectarian, right? So you had Shia Iran with Shia Hezbollah supporting the Alawite regime of Bashar al-Assad. The Alawites are, they believe that they're a breakaway form of Shiism. The Shia believe that they're not Muslims, but they came together and they were mostly killing Sunnis. And some of the radicalization and recruitment material, I mean, really, really horrible sectarian, one side saying that the other is raping your wives and killing your children, and really deeply disgusting sectarian stuff that did kind of further that narrative. But the reality is that it's a little bit of my enemy's enemy is my friend. Sunni and Shia have partnered before in at least a tolerance kind of way when they wanted to target whether it was Jews, whether it was Israel, whether it was the United States. Remember the East Africa embassy bombings by Al-Qaeda in 1988 in Kenya and Tanzania? Those Al-Qaeda bombers, some of them were trained in Iran, some of them were trained by Hezbollah in Lebanon. Remember 9/11? Some of the hijackers were on a plane with Hezbollah personnel from Lebanon to Iran and were able to go into Iran without having visas. We don't know more of the story. You can read about it in the 9/11 Commission report. Cards on the table. I did some consulting for the 9/11 Commission. And they said, look, it needs further investigation, but there's many, many examples like this. So tangibly bringing this back to the now, the majority of Iran's proxy groups are Shia. Hamas is not. Hamas is Sunni. Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Sunni. Right? So when they want to, they will work with Sunnis to suit their purposes.
Okay, now we're going to be quick because there's a lot of people here. And so we're going to go here.
Matthew, in my experience, the younger portion of the Iranian population is quite cosmopolitan and well-educated, and they have nothing in common with the dictatorship theocracy. What prospect is there of the Iranian population rising up against the theocracy? What might that look like, and what might trigger that sort of event?
Yeah. So there's long been lots of hope in that regard. And what the Iranian regime has demonstrated is that they are willing to put bullets in people's heads. There have been a series of protest movements, really, even before, but really since the Green Revolution in 2009. Each one has gotten progressively more kind of overt. In 2009, you didn't hear the protesters saying, death to the Ayatollah, death to the supreme leader. And in subsequent rounds, you did. You heard people saying, why are you giving money to the Hezbollahs and Hamases when we don't have money here? But you're fundamentally right that there is a very significant delta between the youth bulge and the revolutionary leadership, which underscores what I was saying earlier, one of the many reasons why they are so uncomfortable and so lacking in confidence about the longevity of the revolution. In the moment, people are still afraid to do a lot more than they've done already because the regime has demonstrated they will knock heads. They will do some pretty horrible things. They will take a woman who protests by going out in the street wearing her underwear and her bra, and they will put her in a psychiatric hospital where horrible, horrible things are done. A young man, a young Iranian protester who was public about what it was like when he was arrested and put into one of these psychiatric facilities, and the horrible, horrible things. You can read about it. I don't want to talk about it. That the Iranians did to him. Just about a week ago, said, if the Iranians don't release the following people from prison, I'm going to kill myself. They didn't, and he killed himself. So I don't claim to be an expert on domestic Iranian politics, or society. I don't know how long this regime is for this world. I don't believe they're here forever. I can't tell you what it will take, or how long it would be, or what the impetus might be, or even what we might do different. Lots of people who have said, if we just give the protesters just enough money so they can afford not to go to work and go to the streets, it'll all end. People have been saying that to me for 20-something years. There are people who want to do more. If some cars were blowing up on the streets, I don't know that that's what we want to do or that that would work.
Okay, I'm going to be very brief. So, got a question here?
Yes, I have. Have you got any opinion about the Iranian oil industry and the Iranian nuclear facilities in terms of how Israel might decide to proceed?
Okay, a very brief response.
The brief response to that is no. Next. No, but look, I'll just say this. As the Israelis were preparing to respond to the last ballistic missile attack, there was a lot of discussion about this. The Iranians came out very, very publicly and said, let me just make clear, if you hit our oil and gas industry, our first order of business will to hit the same in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, and in Kuwait. And so there's a lot of concern that if you hit Iranian oil facilities, which would hurt them in the pocket, it could make it much more expensive for you to fill up your car, for me to fill up my car, and have impact on other states in the region. So that's part of the calculation. And on the nuclear file, look, at the end of the day, the Israelis in this last round, among the other things they hit, was an undeclared Iranian nuclear facility, not an enrichment facility, but a facility related to the nuclear program. It came out just a couple of weeks ago, took a little while for it to come out, not from the Iranians, because they couldn't really complain about an undeclared facility being hit because it's not supposed to exist. And now it doesn't exist.
Another brief question. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a historical, esoteric question. Oh, okay. Did Islamic State slow Iran down a fair bit, and particularly with the involvement of Qasem Soleimani?
Look, it's no question that the Iranians had to pay attention to the Islamic State, which was carrying out attacks in Iran. The Iranians like to portray themselves as great counterterrorism partners because it wasn't the United States and the counter-ISIL coalition, to include Australia, that inflicted territorial defeat on the Islamic State. And their alternative reality, it was Iran. Iran and Qasem Soleimani were the ones. And it's true, there were times when they were fighting the Islamic State, and there were other times when they were not. Full stop.
If my next door neighbour sent his 12-year-old son at night to set fire to the shed in my backyard, I wouldn't blame his 12-year-old son. I'd call out my neighbour. Why didn't Benjamin Netanyahu on the 7th of October last year say to Iran, these are your proxies? These people wouldn't have done these terrible things to my population if it wasn't for you. You're responsible. If you don't have these hostages released, we will be at war.
I guess the real answer to that would be you'd have to ask the Prime Minister. There was an Israeli War Cabinet meeting on the 11th of October. It took those few days for the Israelis to finish sweeping the south and be confident that there still weren't Hamas operatives running around. Some of them were injured or not injured and still alive and hiding out for some days. On the 11th, there was a big debate in the War Cabinet, not on this point so much as should they first take the fight to Hamas in Gaza, or since Hamas ultimately isn't a truly strategic threat, even though they did this thing that is strategically threatening, should they take the fight to Hezbollah first? We know what happened. I think for the Israelis, what you're saying is strategically the big takeaway. In the moment, they needed to address Hamas mostly because of the hostages. Now going forward, most Israelis would say that while they still need to address the proxies that are most immediately attacking them, that is no longer enough. And I would say it's not incorrect to say that we are now seeing ourselves at the end of the first year of what is probably a decade-long Israeli-Iranian war.
There's a final question coming up. We've got 3 minutes. You want? No, he doesn't. Okay.
Okay. Look, I was just Right, just very briefly. A large cache of Russian, quite modern weapons have been found in southern Lebanon under the control of Hezbollah. What would the aims of Russia be in relation and compared to those of Iran?
So the weaponry, the Russian weaponry that was found in southern Lebanon within Hezbollah weapons caches was both some very, very old stuff, but also some very, very new stuff manufactured in 2020, 2021, in particular these Cornet, third generation Cornet anti-tank guided missiles. First, it's important to say it's not clear how much, if any, of these were provided directly from Russia. It seems that they came from Syrian stock. But my assessment is that Syria doesn't do this without Russia's okay. About a year ago, a colleague of mine and I published a piece for the think tank Rusi in London on the nascent Russian-Hezbollah alliance. So I've been told to answer briefly. You can look that up. It's online. But the bottom line is this alliance involved sanctions busting, Hezbollah helping Russia, Russia helping Hezbollah. It involved weapons. It involved helping Russia get more of the reconstruction business in Syria and business in Lebanon. And it came about because Russia and Hezbollah, and of course also Iran, were the primary allies fighting shoulder to shoulder in defense of the Assad regime in Syria. That was pretty short, right? That was good.
Okay. So we could have got on all night, but we didn't. So look, I'm going to be very brief. It's a warm night tonight and a lot of people here. Many thanks to Matthew Levitt for a terrific performance, giving us a lot of detail along with argument. We'd love to have you back sometime, but for tonight, thank you.